For 33-year-old Joette Mary Smith, a simple Sunday night stroll ended in tragedy after her body was found floating in a river 2 days later. Leads dried up quickly, and it took another 5 years for police to link a possible suspect to the case. However, it would be another 39 years before DNA positively identified the man responsible for the heinous crime. Joette was a popular woman. Friends and family described her as vibrant, outgoing, and a remarkable person with vigor. She was born in September 1949 in Omaha, Nebraska, to parents Bill and Hattie Smith, and was one of 7 siblings. After graduating from St. Albert's High School in Iowa, she went on to study at St. Benedict's College in Kansas. In 1973, Joette moved from Colorado Springs to the San Lorenzo Valley. She'd worked at a fruit and vegetable stand before branching out on her own and opening her restaurant, Buffalo Gals, in 1975. The restaurant was popular, and Joette added a bit of her own flavor. She enjoyed cooking and entertaining, and her attention to detail provided the excellent dining and gave her customers a one-of-a-kind restaurant experience. She was single and had dedicated her life to her restaurant. Joette's goodness shone out of her as she tried to help as many people as possible. When the storm of January 1982 wreaked havoc on the San Lorenzo Valley community, Joette too faced adversity, as her restaurant had taken much damage. Despite this, she volunteered her time and cooked meals for those in need, setting aside her own worries to care for others. Her kindness did not go unnoticed when, at the time, she had almost lost it all. The St. Andrew's Church helped by paying the $500 rent in order to help Joette keep her dream alive. And Joette would continue to pursue her passion until fate took a dark turn. On the night of the 27th of March, 1983, Joette was at home unwinding with her friend Rachel Devereaux, who had been staying with her temporarily. The two enjoyed a quiet night eating popcorn and watching a television series, The Thornbirds. After watching the 11 p.m. news, both women called it a night. Rachel went to sleep while Joette stayed up making some calls. When Rachel woke up at around 3 a.m., she noticed Joette was gone. It wasn't unusual for Joette to go out at night, as her studio apartment was just across the road from the Buffalo Gals restaurant. She'd often pop over to check on the place or get some work done. These innocent assumptions were shattered when Joette did not return the next morning. Everyone's worst fears were confirmed when 36 hours later, a local man playing with his dog discovered Joette's body floating in the San Lorenzo River. When police arrived at the crime scene, Joette was still wearing her pearl necklace, a single nylon stocking, and a black boot. A navy blue cape, which she was often seen wearing, was discovered nearby in the river. Investigators collected numerous items of evidence, including a brown shirt and blue jeans, according to reports. The autopsy later revealed she'd been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. Investigations began in earnest as police canvassed the local area, asking everyone who knew Joette about the events leading up to her murder. On the fateful Sunday night, a barmaid alleged that Joette had walked to the River House bar, but it was closed. Then she made her way to Henfling's Inn, where another barmaid who knew Joette offered her a lift. After purchasing a pack of cigarettes, she declined the woman's offer, saying that it was a pleasant night for a walk home. According to sheriff's investigator Joseph Hennard, they believed that Joette was confronted by her assailant nearby a bridge that was just 50 feet from her apartment. Interviews with friends and family only led police in one direction. Joette was a decent and caring human being. Anyone who spoke to the police only had one thing to say: Joette had no enemies, and her murder was senseless. Van Scriver, who lived next door to the restaurant, said, "In my whole life, I've seen nothing that makes as little sense as her death. It's got everybody upset and angry." David Carlson, a good friend of the bubbly restaurant owner, started a reward fund for information that could lead to the arrest of Joette's killer. Another friend, Daphne McRae, mentioned there was only ever one incident that was suspicious. A tall blonde man had been following Joette, but nothing had come of it. As Joette was laid to rest, friends and family mourned her loss. Those close to her said she'd been acting strangely in the weeks building up to her murder. Joette had started giving away her prized possessions, reconnecting with old friends, and just calling up people to tell them hello and that she cared. She had allegedly told close friends that she believed she was going to die young. Many believe she may have had a premonition. Investigators were determined to find the young woman's killer. Her death had sent shockwaves through the community, and people were scared of venturing out alone in the once safe area. Detectives spent years interviewing dozens of people, but leads dried up, and for 5 years, the case sat cold. Then, in 1998, new information filtered through to investigators. Eric David Drummond's name came up as a person of interest. Investigators learned that Drummond, who would have been about 25 years old, had once asked Joette out on a date while at the Buffalo Gals. Being focused on her business, Joette rebuffed his offer. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Drummond skipped California shortly after Joette's murder. However, further investigation provided police with information that made Drummond a prime suspect. He'd previously been convicted of violent crimes and sexual assault in both California and Nevada. Drummond served about 16 months in prison in 1983 for an attempted homicide and assault in Redding. He then spent 4 years in prison beginning in 1988 for a violent assault on a family and a car theft in Nevada. The sheriff's office said that while there was circumstantial information that could tie Drummond to Joette's murder, no charges could be brought against him without physical evidence. DNA in the 80s had not yet reached such an advanced stage, and so the evidence was bagged, locked away, and preserved. In 2022, the case was reopened as new DNA technology was being introduced into prior cold case investigations. Using the DNA found on Joette's clothing, technicians were able to develop a DNA profile. All they needed now was a match. In late August 2022, investigators tracked down their prime suspect, Drummond. Now aged 64, he was living in Sierra County and gave police the DNA sample they needed. However, Drummond knew his life of freedom was at an end. In a selfish turn of events, Drummond ended his own life in the hills of Sierra County before the final investigation could be completed, announced the sheriff's office. His DNA eventually matched the profile developed from Joette's clothes. For investigators and Joette's family, it was a bittersweet moment. He would not face a jury to answer for Joette's murder. While Drummond would never face criminal charges or a jury of his peers, the sheriff's office is confident that the evidence in this case would support a conviction of Drummond for the murder of Joette Smith, said the sheriff's office on their Facebook page. Joette's family finally spoke out following the announcement of Drummond's involvement in her murder. A woman who said she was Joette's sister wrote on the sheriff's office Facebook page, thanking the investigative team and offering her condolences to Drummond's family. "It's difficult to lose a loved one, but these circumstances will be trying for his family," she wrote. Joette's sisters Yvette and Annette both spoke to the Chronicle newspaper. "Drummond's death was a little bit of a letdown, but I don't feel like we didn't get justice. The DNA was a match and it's closure," said Yvette. Annette said that Joette was the fun one. She only wished that Joette could have lived long enough to be on the Food Network, or that more people could have gotten to know her. Those who murder already show a blatant disregard for a human life, but to take the life of an innocent child is another level of monstrous behavior. When 8-year-old Aseneth Ducat walked the familiar path home from school, little did she know that the bogeyman waited in the shadows. Aseneth Louise Ducat was born on the 24th of July, 1971 in Pennsylvania to parents Alexander and Martha before they relocated to Upper Arlington, Ohio. She was one of 5 children who were raised in a loving home on Malvern Road. Affectionately called Siani, she was a tomboy who loved climbing trees, helping around the house, and gymnastics. She was in the 3rd grade at Barrington Elementary School and was looking forward to the upcoming summer break. On the 3rd of June 1980, Asenath along with her classmates were being unruly and disruptive. To teach them a lesson, her teacher kept the entire class back for 10 minutes after the final bell rang for the school day. 10 minutes that perhaps changed the course of Asenath's life. She now had to make the mile-long walk home. Not unusual for Asenath, as she walked this stretch of road twice daily to and from school. Some of her classmates saw her walking on Waltham Road at around 3:20 p.m. This was the last time anyone would see her alive. At 3:45 p.m., Martha, Asenath's mother, began to worry as her little girl had still not come home. She called her husband Alexander but was unable to speak to him. After leaving him a message, she got into her car and drove down to the school. She spoke to the principal, who reportedly didn't notice anything unusual. Martha then returned home and started calling around to Asenath's teacher and a few of the parents of her fellow classmates. Unable to make heads or tails of the situation, Martha had no choice. She called the police at 4:30 p.m. that afternoon. The Upper Arlington Police Department took immediate action and began searching the area for any signs of Asenath. The massive community effort included children and parents who mobilized to find the little girl. At around 7:30 p.m. that evening, the search came to a tragic end. Patrolman M. Morley had been searching near the sprawling First Community Retirement Village. Here, Waltham Road intersects with Route 33, a few blocks from Asenath's house. The path was used as a service road back in the 80s. Following the road, he came across a drainage ditch, and at the opening of a culvert, he discovered the body of Asenath. Being a volunteer firefighter, Asenath's father Alexander had access to the police scanner. Both he and his wife sat listening for any news. When reports of a girl's body being found just a block from their home came over the radio, he wasted no time and ran to the crime scene. There, he saw for the first time the body of his little girl. In a community of families with young children, the sheer brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through everyone. The age of innocence had been snatched away with the murder of Asenath. For everyone, there was no going back to life before, only looking for a way to overcome this traumatic event. Autopsy reports would later determine that Asenath had been strangled and raped, but the cause of her death was a blunt force blow to her head, inflicted by a 20-pound limestone rock that was taken from the creek riverbed. Further reports state that she'd been beaten or kicked by her attacker, leading to her spleen being ruptured. Evidence found on Asenath's body were brown pubic hair and urine that did not belong to the little girl. Police began an intense investigation, interviewing everyone along the route that Asenath walked daily. Around the crime scene, investigators discovered tracks made by a 10-speed bike. This would become relevant as witnesses started to come forward. A day after the investigation began, a woman came forward with information regarding the murder of Asenath. According to the witness, she'd been driving east on Waltham Road when she saw a clean-cut man who was wearing a white t-shirt carrying a large bundle in both arms. In a bid to find solid leads, the witness agreed to be hypnotized under the direction and supervision of the UAPD. In a statement, police, who have not identified the witness, said her cooperation provided much-needed clues to the case. The witness claimed to have seen a red bike leaning against some bushes. To investigators, the sighting of the bike provided a link to tracks found near Asenath's body. Furthermore, as police interviewed the witness from the day after the murder, investigators on scene discovered Asenath's school papers and umbrella in a grassy area surrounded by tall pine trees. Investigators now believe that it was in this area that Asenath had probably been assaulted before she was taken to the creek and killed. The bike theory resurfaced as the witness's statement about seeing the red bike near some bushes tied in with the possible scene of the initial assault. Investigators were thorough and compiled an index with over 5,000 names of people interviewed through the course of the investigation. They eventually narrowed the number down to around 500 possible people of interest, but were no closer to pinpointing a suspect. Police, however, believed that the killer was a man who was local to the area. Two psychological profiles received by the UAPD in July 1980 described the possible killer as being between 17 to 19 years old and living within 2 miles of the crime scene. Furthermore, the report added that the meeting between the killer and the victim was not accidental. Rather, the killer had been waiting in the area. These findings led police and media to find similarities in the recent spate of crimes against young women in the area. On the 7th of May 1980, a month before the murder of Asenath, another girl aged 9 was attacked while walking home with a friend from a bus stop on Canterbury Lane. When the two girls split up, the victim was grabbed by a man as she passed some bushes while cutting across a yard. The man dragged her to a secluded area. Fortunately, the attacker had been disturbed and the girl suffered injuries to her face, but nothing more. A witness came forward and reported that he'd seen a young man on a maroon bike following the girls. In both incidents, The witnesses described young men aged in their late teens to early 20s. They also noted the presence of a bike in both incidents. The general description of the suspect seemed to fit both crimes. A man with straight black hair, thin, around 6 feet tall, and having an olive-skinned complexion. In other instances, he was described as Caucasian. The 600 names police had initially narrowed down now became 2. These men seemingly fit the profile and descriptions. Although police were looking closer at both men due to anonymous tips provided by the public, they still did not have the evidence that would link them to the crimes, and so they could not be named or charged. Both men resided in Arlington, merely a mile and a half from Asenath's own home. The first suspect was a 20-year-old man who graduated from Upper Arlington High School in 1979. He also had a history of violent incidents with police. It's alleged on the night that Asenath was murdered, the very same man had gone to a local bar and, while there, began to cry and tell friends he did not want to go back home, fearing they would be after him. That same evening, he'd taken his parents' car and fled to Cleveland. Once again, he had another run-in with police. His picture was included in a lineup and shown to witnesses and the victim from the Canterbury Lane incident, who picked him out, stating that his photo closely resembled the man seen riding the bike that day. Incidentally, police discovered that the man owned a 10-speed red bike. According to a report, a social worker told the court that the man had a history of mental illness and paranoia. In 1984, though, the same man committed suicide by jumping from his room in a downtown Columbus YMCA. There was no physical evidence linking the man to Asenath. The second suspect also graduated from the same high school a year earlier in 1978. It was 4 months after Asenath's murder that this man fell under the police radar. On the 27th of September 1980, he'd been driving down a road in Columbus and saw a 13-year-old girl riding her bike. He parked further up the road at a turn so she'd not notice the car when she came back around. As she approached, he grabbed her from the bike and proceeded to drag her into a wooded area. Fortunately, 3 women who saw the incident unfolding before them rushed to the girl's rescue. He fled, but not before these witnesses were able to take down the number plate of his car. When he was eventually arrested, police discovered a red 10-speed bike at his home and had it impounded. He refused to speak to officials from the UAPD regarding Asenath's murder. Although he raised the eyebrows of investigators, there was just no evidence linking him back to Asenath's murder. In January 1981, he was tried and convicted for the attempted abduction of the girl from Columbus and sentenced to 3 to 10 years, but was paroled after serving just 2 years. The weeks dragged on, and more witnesses came forward. The community was still reeling from the incidents over the past few months. They were under siege from a killer preying on their children. But the UAPD had a new theory supported by new evidence. Seeing as the 2 primary suspects didn't have any physical links to the crime, in November 1980, police theorized that Asenath may have been abducted by a motorist. This theory hinged on information provided by Asenath's mother. Allegedly, Asenath told her mother that she'd been followed by a man in a car twice, but it was later reported that this occurred once. Police also found a woman who claimed to be walking along Waltham Road to fetch her son, but had never seen Asenath. Police believe Asenath was kidnapped between Arlington Road and Cambridge Boulevard by a man in a car. What puzzled the police further was that on the day of Asenath's murder, it was a primary election day. People would have been all over walking through the very same park police believe she was assaulted in and through the service road where her body was found. Somehow, though, the new theory also failed to sit well with many, as it could not explain why Asenath's school papers and umbrella were found in the grassy park area, or how a tracking dog sniffed out a physical trail that led to the culvert if she'd been taken in a car. The lack of technology created a hurdle for the case, and years began to fly by as investigators looked for a phantom. In 1990, the biological evidence collected from the crime scene was sent to the FBI to conduct tests in order to determine if a strong DNA profile could be found. Nothing matched. It took another 18 years before police received information regarding a DNA profile match that linked one of the UAPD's suspects to the case. But given the history of the case, investigators were determined to see it through to the end by doing a thorough re-examination of all the evidence. For the next 14 years, detectives worked with the remaining evidence but found no link to any other suspect. During that time, former classmates of Asenath started a website in 2019 dedicated to the murdered girl. The Long Walk Home, the Asenath Ducat Project, was created to raise awareness and remember the tragedy that befell the Upper Arlington community. In August 2022, police finally released the name of their suspect, Brent L. Strutner. Brent had been the first of the two suspects investigators had looked into in 1980. He was the man who committed suicide in 1984 in Columbus. In 2008, they had already known Brent's DNA matched the Asenath Ducat case, but did not release the information until they were absolutely certain. We wanted to make sure all the pieces and parts were tied together before we released anything. Strutner was a suspect long before we had the ability to identify him, said Sergeant Brian McCain. The second suspect had been one of Brent's known associates, Robert Chris Winchester. He was responsible for the attempted abduction in Columbus in September 1980 and had served his time. However, police were unable to discover sufficient evidence to also link him to the murder of Asenath. Police Chief Steve Farmer said that the UAPD had tirelessly pursued justice for the Ducat family for 4 decades, and that he appreciated the enormous effort and hard work that has been put into the case. Our hearts continue to go out to the Ducat family, and we wish them peace as they continue their healing, said Farmer. In a statement released by the Long Walk Home website, the group stated that the case may have been closed, but for them, it was far from closed. They applauded the hard work and countless hours put into the investigation in finding and identifying Brent Strutner, but believe that he did not act alone. They state that they'll continue to strive to bring justice to all involved in Asenath's murder. The 28th of September 2015 was a violent night in Cincinnati, Ohio. In a matter of 5 hours, 8 people had been shot with 1 fatality. 30-year-old Marcus Lampson had been returning from the gym when he was gunned down in a crime that can only be described as senseless. Marcus was a self-described rapper who reports suggest was a well-liked person in the community of College Hill in Cincinnati. Although Marcus had some run-ins with the law, he turned his life around, becoming a respected person in the area. Those who knew him said he was a man with a big heart.
And I heard 1 gunshot. I never thought anything of it, and just went on to bed after that.
Marcus could always be found at the College Hill Rec Center. Rick Schroeder, who worked at the rec center, said Marcus loved basketball, working out, and was strong. He couldn't think of any reason someone would want to hurt him.
Every day. I just saw him last night about 8 o'clock. And we talked I was going in talking to some other folks, and he stopped me and asked me, "Hey, are you okay, Mr. Rick?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine, Marcus." Had such a good heart and wanted to help people all the time.
Marcus lived with his mother and was her primary caregiver. On the evening of the 28th of September 2015, Marcus and an unidentified friend had gone to a local boxing gym before going to eat. At around 1:30 a.m. the next morning, they were walking home when a Ford Focus pulled up beside them. The occupants of the car asked Marcus what he was carrying in the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. It was late and Marcus didn't want trouble, so both he and his friend ignored the question and picked up their pace. The men from the car didn't take well to being ignored and ordered Marcus and his friend to lie face down at gunpoint. After taking his bag, one of the men shot Marcus with a .22 caliber gun in the neck, torso, and aorta. His friend was spared. The gunman then sped off, leaving Marcus to bleed out. It was a busy night with all the shootings being reported in the area. Police responded to calls from residents of the Blue Fountain apartment in the 1600 block of Cedar Avenue. When they arrived, Marcus's friend was holding his hand and saying, "Hang in there, help is coming." It was too late. Marcus was pronounced dead at the scene. He was gunned down just outside his very own apartment complex. Police searched the area and recovered Marcus's bag close to the crime scene. His friend confirmed that the bag only contained his Everlast boxing gloves and nothing else of value. Police were later able to identify 3 different DNA profiles from the boxing gloves. Police canvassed the area and interviewed witnesses. They were able to confirm that the motive for the murder was robbery. Despite an investigation, the case eventually went cold. It would take another 7 years before Marcus's killer was found. Through the witness statement provided by Marcus's friend and evidence at the scene, 28-year-old William Markel Love was identified as the shooter. On the 10th of November 2022, a warrant was filed and Markel was arrested and charged for the murder the next day in Hardin County, Kentucky. Markel was no stranger to the law and was quick to violence. In 2014, he was arrested and sent to prison on charges of trafficking heroin. It's unclear why he was released. After the shooting of Marcus, Markel seemed to have disappeared until the 4th of August 2019. He was arrested and charged with 5th-degree felony of animal cruelty after fatally stabbing his girlfriend's dog during an altercation. He was held on a $10,000 bond and sentenced to probation. Shortly before being arrested, Markel allegedly suffered a meltdown at the Christ Hospital in Cincinnati. He was arrested and took a plea deal for disorderly conduct. After the arrest warrant was issued, Elizabethtown police picked up Markel from the Baptist Health Hardin Hospital, where he was being treated for undisclosed reasons. He was detained at the Hardin County Detention Center without bond. He awaits extradition back to Ohio to face charges in the murder of Marcus Lamson. The second man has not yet been identified. Two women from two different walks of life, irrevocably intertwined by a single act of brutality. For nearly 4 decades, investigators worked tirelessly to find a man who'd become a phantom. Advancements in DNA would eventually help link the two crimes that haunted not only the families of the victims, but Canadian authorities as well. Susan Tice was a 45-year-old mother of 4 teenagers. She was a family therapist and held a master's degree in social work and worked primarily with disadvantaged children. Having recently been divorced, Susan needed a change and moved from Calgary for a fresh start in Toronto. When Susan failed to show up at a family function in Brampton, relatives grew concerned and tried to contact her. There was no answer. Susan's brother-in-law decided to check up on Susan at her Bickford Park home on the 17th of August 1983. He noticed the mail had piled up outside her home before he made the horrific discovery. Susan's home had been ransacked and all was silent. Moving carefully through the house, he discovered Susan dead in her upstairs bedroom. Investigators arrived at the crime scene and quickly got to work bagging evidence and following up leads. An autopsy revealed that Susan had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed to death in her own home. Although a thorough investigation was done, interviews with loved ones yielded no new information and persons of interest checked out. There were just no leads. The case sat unsolved. 4 months later, another woman met a similar fate. On the 20th of December 1983, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore was discovered dead in her Yorkville apartment by a friend who had come to pick her up for a cocktail party. It was the same MO, ransacked apartment, and Erin stabbed to death in her bed. The coroners discovered she too had been assaulted before being murdered. Erin was the daughter of mining tycoon and Fiji Water founder David Gilmore. She aspired to pursue a career in fashion design, but these dreams were cut short. Again, investigators canvassed door to door, but no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. The murder of Erin garnered much attention, but despite the publicity, nothing came from the investigation. Like Susan, Erin's murder went unsolved. Years turned to decades, and investigators were no closer to finding anything new, apart from the similarities. The murders became cold cases and left behind a sense of lingering unease for detectives. That is, until 2008, when new technology and advancements in DNA testing brought about the missing link. Testing on the evidence found at both crime scenes provided investigators with an unknown male DNA profile that linked the perpetrator to both murders. The two cases became one, and now detectives were looking for a double murderer. It was a starting point, but the technology of the time did not allow for definitive answers. The cold case started warming up, but patience was required. In 2019, genetic genealogy testing had been in its infancy. Toronto police partnered with US-based lab Othram Inc. to develop a family tree from the DNA recovered at both crime scenes. In 2022, the search narrowed down to 5 brothers. By process of elimination, 4 were cleared after samples did not match the profile. On the 24th of November 2022, officers from the Ontario Provincial Police, along with Detective Constable Andrew Doyle of the Toronto Police Service, arrived at the home of 61-year-old Joseph George Sutherland in Moosonee, Ontario. Prior to this, investigators tried to surreptitiously obtain a sample from Sutherland. When this failed, they approached and managed to convince a judge that they had reasonable proof to believe he was behind the murders of both Susan and Aaron. A warrant was granted, and Sutherland provided the DNA sample without incident. The match proved positive. Sutherland had been 22 years old and living in Toronto at the time of the murders. He later moved to Moosonee, a remote town near James Bay. His Facebook profile reveals a man who had been going about living a normal life. The pictures suggest he enjoyed the outdoors and, like anyone else on the social platform, griped about everyday matters. Sutherland was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He's expected to appear in court on the 9th of December 2022. In the meanwhile, investigators have begun reviewing Sutherland's movements to check if he was responsible for any other crimes in the years since the murders of both women. Should the case proceed to court, it will be the first time in Canada that a person has been tried after being arrested using genetic genealogy research. Police Chief James Raymer acknowledges that the case's closure was bittersweet. As relieved as we are to announce this arrest, it will never bring back Aaron or Susan, he said. For the family of Aaron, it was a relief that they finally had the answers. Aaron's brother Sean McCowan said he had burst into tears after receiving the best phone call he had ever had in his life. "This is the day that I, and we, have been waiting almost an entire lifetime for," he said. Erin is survived by her father and both her younger brothers, Sean and Kaylin. Her mother, Anna, died 2 years before the case was solved and was haunted by not knowing the truth. For Susan's family, it was torture not knowing who had taken their mother from them. Knowing that their last moments in life were so filled with terror, let's not beat around the bush. This was like torture. "It's probably the scariest way that we have as women to go," said Christian Tice, Susan's only daughter. She said she had done a fist bump with her mother's photo after hearing the news and said out loud, "We got him for you." Although it's still just a criminal charge, both families believe that they have finally got the right person. No matter how long the wait, justice will prevail, and no one should give up hope in finding the answers.
It's hard to put into words.
Marysville Investigations Commander Rob Lambro worked this case from the very beginning. 19-year-old Jennifer Brinkman murdered in her own bedroom, strangled, and cut up with an axe. A case that has haunted this community for nearly a quarter of a century. Until now.
19-year-old Jennifer Brinkman opened a new chapter of her life in 1998 when she moved to the town of Marysville, Washington with her father and his girlfriend. Her father, Michael Brinkman, found a pleasant home on Grove Street in the small town of Marysville, Washington. The neighborhood had its own school, convenience store, library, and some grocery stores, all within walking distance from the Brinkman house. Jennifer quickly became known in the neighborhood because of her extremely friendly nature, even though she neither attended school nor worked. She regularly walked to the local stores, as well as the library, which gave her an opportunity to converse with a lot of people. She never shied away from stopping and engaging in a conversation, even with a stranger. Her knack for conversing was not limited to face-to-face conversation either. Jennifer really enjoyed chatting on telephone chat lines and chat rooms. Despite her outgoing nature, Jennifer had no known friends in Marysville. Perhaps the strongest reason behind this was her mental capacity, which was only at the level of a 13 or 14-year-old. But Jennifer did not let that hold her back. Jennifer had some family members living in the Bothell, Kirkland, and Bellevue areas of Washington, and she often spent time with them in these cities. On March 13, 1998, Jennifer's father, Michael, invited Jennifer on a week-long trip with them and his girlfriend to Disneyland in California. However, Jennifer declined their offer, saying that she preferred to stay home. Initially, Michael was hesitant to let his developmentally handicapped daughter stay at home alone, since she'd never been left alone for an extended amount of time. However, because she was so adamant about skipping the trip, despite his reservations, he eventually allowed Jennifer to stay home. He could never have foreseen that decision would forever change their lives. Bidding goodbye to his daughter, Michael headed to California along with his girlfriend, not realizing that that was the last time he was seeing her ever again. Jennifer was last seen on March 16, 1998, 3 days after her father left for his trip when she was walking to the neighborhood convenience store located just a few blocks from her house. On March 21, 1998, 8 days after they left, Michael returned home from the trip only to witness a grisly scene. He found his 19-year-old daughter lying on her bedroom floor with severe wounds on her neck and back. In a moment of panic, he ran down the street to flag down a police officer. As deputies from the Marysville police entered the house, they found no signs of forced entry. Evidence suggested that Jennifer had likely been dead for several days prior to the discovery of her body. They also discovered the murder weapon, an axe, in close proximity to the body. Signs of a struggle were present at the crime scene. On March 24, 1998, the autopsy report determined the cause of death to be the result of homicidal violence stemming from axe wounds to the neck. The axe that had caused these fatal injuries was recovered from the scene. A large amount of potential evidence was collected from the crime scene, including DNA. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab was able to develop a DNA profile of an unknown man, potentially belonging to the killer. Despite that, the lack of technology back then prevented them from identifying the killer. After the initial investigation, the case subsequently went cold. Decades passed before advancements could be made in the case. In 2020, after the case was reopened, the DNA sample was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, which is a Virginia-based company that's renowned for helping law enforcement agencies nationwide to solve cold cases through their advanced forensic mapping techniques. In early 2022, the lab results came back identifying a person of interest, Jeffrey Paul Premo. 52-year-old Premo was a longtime resident of Renton, Washington. In the initial stages of the investigation, back in 1998, police contacted Premo after finding a letter from him in Jennifer's possession. Despite the verbiage of the letter indicating that there'd been a meeting between Jennifer and Premo prior to her murder, Premo denied ever meeting or even knowing Jennifer. Police theorized that Premo, who used to spend time on various chat lines, met Jennifer in one of them before meeting her in person. As investigators do not have any solid proof to link him with Jennifer's murder, they couldn't press any charges. Eventually, through a search warrant, law enforcement secured a DNA sample from Premo, which he willingly submitted. The DNA sample matched with both the DNA found on the letter as well as fingernail scrapings taken from Jennifer. On November 28, 2022, Jeffrey Paul Premo was arrested in the Puget Sound area and charged with 1 count of murder in the first degree. He was later booked at the Snohomish County Jail. However, before detectives could interrogate him about the potential motive for the murder, he invoked his constitutional rights. The original lead detective on the case, Rob Lamoureux of Marysville Police Department, stated in a press conference, "It's hard to put into words. We've got a conclusion to this. We're finally able to put it on a shelf and have some closure. However, closure was not as sweet as it should have been. Sadly, Jennifer's father was not fortunate to see this day as he died in 2013, never knowing the fate of his daughter's killer." Detectives who informed Jennifer's mother about this news expressed that she was extremely emotional upon hearing that an arrest had been made in the case. She was grateful to the investigators for never giving up on Jennifer's case, which had finally come to a conclusion after 24 years. Evelyn Marie Fisher was born on March 23, 1947, to parents Charles and Ethel Fisher in Sardis. She grew up in a nice home with her brother Leonard. After residing in her hometown of Sardis, British Columbia for most of her life, Evelyn moved to Miami, Florida. After graduating from Riverview's School of Psychiatric Nursing, she was hired as a nurse at a Florida psychiatric facility. In the late 1970s, Evelyn was well settled in her life. She married John Bamforth in 1969 and soon moved to the mobile home in Miramar, about 30 minutes outside of Miami, with her husband to start their life together. On January 22, 1980, 32-year-old Evelyn was home, recovering from a recent knee surgery. A friend who was staying with them at the time returned to the house to discover that the doors were locked. Eventually, she managed to gain entrance to the trailer. Inside the bedroom, she discovered Evelyn's badly beaten body. She'd been sexually assaulted and brutally bludgeoned to death in her own bed while her husband, John, was at work. When John returned home that afternoon, he arrived to see crime scene tape on his door. Inside the home, he saw that there were clear signs of a struggle. The furniture and the cushions had been disturbed, and the bed was soaked with Evelyn's blood. Unfortunately, the gruesome crime scene did not give away many clues that led investigators to the killer. A small amount of unknown DNA was collected from the scene. The evidence was preserved to be used later when DNA technology became more advanced. Meanwhile, without many leads to go on, investigators began questioning people in and around the neighborhood in hopes of getting any significant information regarding the assailant. However, no information or eyewitnesses could be found, despite extensive investigation. The case garnered adequate local media coverage, but that too failed to come to garner any more information. Although in the initial stages of the investigation, police had a person of interest on their radar, no charges were pressed at the time due to insufficient evidence to build a case. The only evidence police really had was a small specimen collected at the crime scene. However, back in those days, there were no tools for developing a DNA profile, not to mention the small quantity and low quality of the specimen found in the case. Thus, the case went cold. Every few years, detectives revisited the cold case to see if there was any progress that could be made, but they were always met with disappointment. Evelyn's heartbroken family had to try to get on with their lives, all the while praying for the answers they so desperately needed. After remaining inactive for more than 40 years, the case was reopened in 2021. By this time, forensic analysts were able to develop DNA profiles from even the smallest and degraded samples. Thanks to advanced DNA technologies, hundreds of cold cases were now being solved across the nation around this time. Following the footsteps of other cases that had been solved using modern methods, investigators from the Miramar Police Department sent the DNA sample to a lab for advanced DNA testing. The lab results came back identifying a suspect, Ronald Eugene Richards. Richards was, in fact, the same person of interest that investigators had in the initial investigation, but there was never enough evidence to make an arrest. At the time of Evelyn's murder, Richards lived just 12 houses away from her home in Miramar. Richards had an extensive criminal record. In 1975, he was arrested after sexually assaulting and attempting to kill his then-girlfriend, which landed him on the police's radar after Evelyn's murder. Shortly before Evelyn's murder, he was released from prison and resided in the same area. In 1982, he was convicted of another murder that occurred in Volusia County in 1980 and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Investigators theorized that Richards broke in through the window of Evelyn's mobile home and attacked her while she was sleeping in her bedroom. After brutally murdering her, he fled the scene. However, they could not clarify if there was a connection between Richards and the victim before the murder. Thanks to technological advancements, police finally linked the murder of Evelyn Marie Fisher Bamworth to now 75-year-old Ronald Eugene Edwards, who's currently locked up in an Ohio prison. In December 2022, he was indicted for the sexual battery and murder of Evelyn and is pending extradition to Broward County to face charges. Investigators are speculating as to whether Richards is a serial killer, suggesting that he had other potential victims. Evelyn's then-husband, John Bamforth, expressed his gratitude for the diligent efforts of the investigators, which led to a resolution in this case after 4 decades. He remembered how he fell in love at first sight with his former wife and lamented about losing her at the hands of a monster. He stated, "You never have closure, as you can tell, but certainly justice for Evelyn is the most important thing." This case was the oldest cold case in the history of the Miramar Police Department. In 1990, 17-year-old Seattle resident Michelle Koski's life was just beginning to blossom. Born on August 9, 1973, Michelle was the only child to her mother, Violet Simonson, and the two shared a close bond. Violet remembers her daughter being outspoken at home, but shy in public. She loved animals and enjoyed spending her time with her friends. She was active and enjoyed both indoor and outdoor activities. Out of them all, softball and cards were her favorites. She first attended Northgate Elementary School, but after a few years, she transferred to Summit K-12 Alternative School after skipping a grade. Despite the change, Michelle remained close to her longtime friends. In 1990, 17-year-old Michelle was still attending high school while working part-time at a local Taco Bell. At the time, she was living in an apartment which she shared with her 28-year-old boyfriend in the Lake City area of Seattle, Washington. By August of that year, she had made plans to attend college to pursue law the following fall after finishing high school. Apparently, Michelle confided to her best friend, Melissa Johnson, that she was planning to move out of her boyfriend's apartment in Lake City and was excited to spend more time with her family and friends. On August 20th, 1990, just a week after her 17th birthday, Michelle got a ride from a friend from her Lake City apartment to a spot where teenagers often hung out and rode motorcycles. This was just about 14 miles away in Snohomish County. That was the last time anyone heard from her. 5 days later, on August 25th, 1990, a woman walking her dog near Highway 522 and Echo Lake Road in Snohomish County discovered a partially clothed female body. When investigators from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department responded to the scene, they found a grisly murder scene. The young woman had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and bludgeoned to death before being left to rot in the woods near Highway 22 and Echo Lake Road in the southeast part of Snohomish County on the outskirts of Seattle. Investigators discovered that the killer used a chunk of concrete from a nearby pile to finish her off. Only through dental records were investigators able to identify the victim as 17-year-old Michelle Koski. Investigators collected bodily fluid found on the victim's body as evidence, but that was about it as far as physical evidence that would tie a suspect to the crime. Initially, Michelle's much older boyfriend was looked at closely, but he was eventually ruled out, as was the friend who gave her a ride on the day she was last seen. At the time of the murder, the Green River Killer was terrorizing the area and had a similar MO, so Seattle investigators considered Michelle may have fallen victim to the Green River Killer as well. However, without any new leads, the case went cold for decades. In 2005, detectives David Heitzman and Jim Scharf from the newly formed Snohomish County Cold Case Unit took another look at the murder. After determining that the DNA left behind at the crime scene and on the victim had to have belonged to the killer, they updated it to the CODIS database. However, there was no match in the database. After this brief review, detectives had little else to go on, and the case went cold once again. In 2012, Detective Scharf told Fox Network that their theory was that Michelle met up with someone who lured her away with the promise of alcohol. Then they surmised the person may have made sexual advances towards her, which she declined. Out of rage at being rejected, he then attacked and strangled her as she tried to flee. Detective Scharf further said he was convinced that Michelle knew her killer because of the violent manner of the crime, which suggested an underlying fury. Although he hoped someone would come forward to reveal new information, the case remained cold over the next decade. 3 decades after Michelle's tragic demise, Detective Jim Scharf and the Snohomish Cold Case Unit teamed up with Parabon Nanolab to solve this case with the help of genetic genealogy, which uses DNA evidence from a crime scene along with public ancestry databases to ID a suspect through their family tree. Finally, in 2022, through extensive research on GED databases, Parabon was able to positively identify the killer as Robert Brooks. Brooks was never on the radar of the investigators throughout the investigation until DNA implicated him in the crime. However, in 1990, at the age of 22, Brooks was living just a few blocks away from Michelle's home. He had just been released from prison on April 18, 1990, after serving time for an undisclosed juvenile crime. He was staying with a relative at the time of the murder. Sadly, justice could never be served in this case, as Brooks died in 2016 from natural causes at the age of 48. Michelle's mother, Violet Simonson, who almost lost hope after nearly 3 decades, stated that she was amazed by the news, commenting, "I thought I would take it to my grave. After 20 years, what are the chances? Michelle Koski's case was the 24th to be solved by Detective Scharf and the Cold Case Unit. In just the past 4 years, they've solved 15 cases using genetic genealogy. The very day the press conference was held to announce the close of Michelle's case was the first day of Scharf's retirement. 54-year-old Nora Sheehan was a married mother of 2 and a longtime resident of Cork, Ireland. On June 6, 1981, Nora went to the emergency department of the South Infirmary Hospital in Ballyfehany in Cork City, Ireland, to be treated for a dog bite to her arm. She was last seen around 9:45 p.m. that same night outside the medical facility. After that, she vanished into thin air. When Nora did not return home from the hospital that night, her concerned family called the police to file a missing person report. Fearing that Nora could be in danger, the National Police Force of Ireland, or Guardians of the Peace of Ireland, which is more commonly referred to as Gardaí, immediately launched an investigation to find the missing mother. Despite the extensive search effort by Gardaí, as well as Nora's family, there were no signs of her. That is, until 6 days after her mysterious disappearance. On June 12, 1981, forestry workers found a decomposing female body at a place known as the Viewing Point in Shipple Woods near Inishannon in West Cork, about 18 miles from where Nora was last seen alive. The remains were taken for post-mortem and later identified as Nora Sheehan. The post-mortem also suggested that she died from injuries consistent with a violent death, indicating a homicide. She was sexually assaulted and strangled to death with her own summer dress. The time of death could not be pinpointed exactly, but it was determined that she died somewhere between June 6th and June 12th. A thorough investigation was conducted, but investigators were unable to collect enough evidence to tie anyone to her murder. Before long, the case grew cold. The mystery would not come back to life until 40 years later. Meanwhile, Nora's devastated family was left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives with no answers. Almost 6 years ago, in 2016, the Garda Serious Crime Review team reopened the cold case and spent the ensuing years scanning through detailed records and evidence associated with the case. Then, in 2022, there was a breakthrough. Detectives were finally able to identify a suspect in Nora Sheehan's murder. His name was Noel Long. The now 73-year-old Noel Long was living in Malbone in the West Passage area in Cork, surviving on a state pension. He would have been around 41 years old at the time of the crime. Noel was the prime suspect in Nora's murder at the time of the initial investigation. However, authorities did not go forward to press charges against him, as the forensic pathologist who had carried out the autopsy on Nora's body died before Noel could be prosecuted and could not provide testimony. Noel, a former Army cadet, had an extensive criminal record over the years. He was just 20 years old when he committed his first violent sexual attack. He dragged a 23-year-old woman with special needs into a rundown house in Crosshaven in Cork, where he sexually assaulted and beat her. 4 years later, at the age of 24, he abducted a 16-year-old girl and forced her into his car as she was walking her dog. He threatened to beat her and attempted to sexually assault her, but was caught in the act by a passerby who intervened and rescued the poor girl. He was convicted as a felon and was sentenced to 12 months in prison. Just a year before Nora's murder, in 1980, Noel was the prime suspect in another savage sexual assault attack on a 25-year-old woman in Cork. In 2007, Noel was convicted of threatening and abusive behavior towards his sister in front of their dying mother. He was given a 3-month suspended prison sentence. The sister said that the incident occurred when Noel ordered her out of their mother's room at Cork University Hospital. When the woman refused to leave their mother on her deathbed, she claimed that Noel became aggressive towards her and threatened her using explicit language. He also stated that being the sole caretaker of their mother, Noel cruelly isolated the elderly woman from the rest of her family and forbade her to contact any of her other children. However, Noel always denied these allegations. Noel had even more convictions on his record as well, including assault, traffic offenses, and burglary. After gathering all the evidence against him regarding Nora's murder, on June 28, 2022, 73-year-old Noel Long was arrested from his Malbone home and charged with 1 count of murder. more than 40 years after Nora Sheehan's tragic demise. When he was told what he was being charged with, he remained silent and stoic. Currently, Noah Long is incarcerated in the Cork prison. His trial is set to begin in June 2023. Originally from northern Florida, Joy Hibbs was happily married to the love of her life, Charlie Hibbs. After getting married in 1974, the couple lived in different places across the country before finally settling in a one-story home at 1200 Spencer Drive in Croydon, Bristol Township in Pennsylvania. Within a few years, the couple became the proud parents of a son, David, which was soon followed by a daughter, Angie. Joy was known to be a spirited, charming, polite, and easygoing woman. She had a keen interest in gardening and liked to share her homegrown vegetables with the neighbors. She loved cooking as well, especially anything fried. She was beautiful both inside and out, and true to her name, she was truly a joy to be around. On Saturdays, Joy and Charlie Hibbs rode their motorcycles to flea markets around their neighborhood. David and Angie often joined their parents on those trips. The family also spent most of their weekend fishing and camping. While Charlie worked in construction, Joy worked as a receptionist in a medical clinic in Bensalem. She was said to be a delightful co-worker. On the morning of April 19, 1991, 35-year-old Joy cashed in her paycheck at a local bank. She then left the bank at around 10 a.m. and then went grocery shopping, which was a regular Friday routine for her. She came home around 11 a.m. and went to walk her dog. Shortly after, two people from Bensalem Baptist Church stopped by the house after Joy had expressed her desire to join the church. She decided she was interested in joining after attending an Easter Sunday service a few weeks before at the invitation of a coworker. The people from the church were gone by 11:50 a.m., leaving Joy alone in her home. That afternoon, 12-year-old David headed back home after his class was dismissed early. He was excited to show his report card to his mother because he'd made the honor roll. Unfortunately, his mother would never get the chance to celebrate his achievement. As he got to the house, he noticed his mother's maroon Mercury Cougar in the driveway, which meant his mother would be home. He was just entering the house when he saw smoke coming out of a window. He then ran around to the back entrance, where he usually entered the house. As the boy pulled open the back door, which opened into the kitchen area, a cloud of thick black smoke pushed him back while flames were roaring inside. Scared for his mother's life, David screamed to get the attention of a neighbor who was mowing his lawn outside. When the neighbor looked up, he too saw the smoke rising from the Hibbs' home. Within minutes, a half-dozen other neighbors tried in vain to extinguish the flames using garden hoses, as someone called the fire department. When firefighters reached the scene, the house was completely engulfed by the flames. Paramedics placed a hysterical David in the back of an ambulance. The scene inside the bedroom was horrific. Firefighters found the lifeless body of 35-year-old Joy Hibbs in her son's bedroom, lying face up on a mattress that had been reduced to just springs. The entire room was charred, and Joy's body lay amongst the ashes, resembling a blackened mummy. Fire investigators initially assumed that Joy was the tragic victim of a house fire. However, a coroner's report the next day confirmed that, although her death was tragic, it was no accident. Due to the extreme damage from the fire, there were very few clues at the crime scene. The fire had destroyed much of the interior of the home. Upon further investigation, it was discovered her cause of death was strangulation by her son's computer cord after being severely beaten and stabbed. Joy's badly burned body would not betray any clues for the coroner to determine if a sexual assault occurred. However, the snap of her jeans was intact, which suggested that she had not been. She was already dead when the house caught fire. They also theorized that the fire was set by the perpetrator to cover his tracks with the intent to destroy evidence. Joy's wallet was stuffed in the living room couch, but several items, including cash, were missing from the purse. In addition to the lack of evidence due to the inferno, authorities were having trouble establishing a motive as well. As authorities began questioning neighbors, two important pieces of information came to light. At least one neighbor saw a 1980s model dark blue Chevrolet Monte Carlo had haphazardly parked in front of the Hibbs' house between 12:30 and 1 p.m. the afternoon of the fire. Another neighbor witnessed a man going inside the house around the same time. Investigators from the Bristol Police Department investigated the tips, but in the end, they seemed to lead nowhere. At that time, Monte Carlos were quite a popular vehicle. Although police did have a hunch as to who their suspect could be, there simply was not enough evidence to charge anyone. Over the years, police occasionally reviewed the case, but were unable to glean any new information. Much to the disappointment and heartbreak of Joy's family, the case remained cold for years. Finally, in 2022, there's a breakthrough in the case. Police finally gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. The suspect was identified as Robert Atkins after some new evidence came to light. As it turns out, Atkins was high on detectives' radar during the initial investigation. Atkins, who owned a Monte Carlo, occasionally sold marijuana to Charlie and Joy. In fact, the couple allegedly had an argument with Atkins regarding marijuana days prior to Joy's murder. After investigators asked him to take a polygraph test, he refused, claiming he had nerve damage that would give an inaccurate result. To the investigators who were working on the case, Atkins was their only suspect. However, the witness who saw the Monte Carlo outside the Hibbs' residence insisted that it did not match Atkins' car. Atkins also presented an alibi in which he claimed he was in the Poconos with his family at the time of the murder, which his wife corroborated. In another interview with police, Atkins claimed that he was working as a confidential informant for the Bristol Police Department regarding the illegal purchasing of marijuana, which turned out to be true. Although investigators still had their suspicions about the guy, due to his tight alibi and lack of proper evidence against him, he was cleared. No other suspects were ever found in the case in the years following that. Yet the Hibbs family never gave up hope on finding her killer. Recently, Atkins' ex-wife, who kept tight-lipped all these years out of fear, finally came clean and testified before a grand jury, saying that in the early afternoon of April 19, 1991, the day of Joy Hibbs' murder, Atkins came home covered in blood. He told her that he'd stabbed someone and ignited a fire in their house in an effort to cover up his crime. After showering and washing his bloody clothes, he headed out with his family to the Poconos. They remained there for 2 days before returning on Sunday, April 21st, when she learned the news about the murder. After this groundbreaking testimony from Atkins' ex-wife, on May 25, 2022, 58-year-old Robert Atkins was arrested at his Fairless Hills home and charged with first-degree and second-degree murder, arson, and robbery in connection with Joy Hibbs' death. Justice finally caught up with them more than 30 years after the gruesome killing. The Hibbs family said in a statement, "For 31 years, our family has been haunted by this tragic loss, knowing without a doubt that Robert Atkins was the perpetrator." Robert Atkins is currently being held at the Bucks County Correctional Facility without the possibility of bail. In this day and age, it's getting harder and harder for criminals to escape justice, even after years. Even if they were not around to face justice on this earthly realm, one can hope that wherever they are, they're facing at least a fraction of the torment that they put their victims and their families through. If you enjoyed today's cases, why not subscribe? Hit the like button and bell notification to receive the latest videos in your inbox. Until then, stay safe.